Under his leadership, Forbes became the voice of business, influencing generations. His name became a symbol of success, his experience a guide for new generations of entrepreneurs. Through the pages of Forbes, he told the world about business and became part of it himself. A man who knows how big ideas work, how a name is built, how new meanings are born in the world of business. Today, he is here to share experience, vision, story. Welcome, media mogul, visionary, inspiring speaker, Steve Forbes.
Warm welcome, Mr. Forbes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Let's give another round for those great entrepreneurs of the future, because as you get older, you're going to depend on their success for your retirement. So in terms of looking at the world today, the problems that we have today, and what we must do to move ahead. First, I would like to... They want to make sure I have liquidity, which some central banks are not supplying enough of today. So I'd like to chat about the global economy, where we're at, where it's going, success stories and failures that Uzbekistan can learn from, and then finally some investment areas to look at for the future, whether it's a new material called graphene, which is going to revolutionize the world. Of course, artificial intelligence. I was discussing with some of your colleagues earlier why artificial intelligence is a terrible name for this revolution. You don't call airplanes artificial birds. You don't call automobiles artificial horses. So there's a lot of unnecessary fear out there, but AI is going to be overall a great boon for the future. And then finally, I'm going to make a prediction that most economists won't agree with, but I think it's coming, which will be good news for your country, and that is in the next decade, the world is going to go back to a gold standard monetary system. So in terms of the global economic crisis, there is the possibility of a global trade war thanks to all of these tariffs that my country is imposing. We also have inflation that is still with us. Most of the country's currencies are weak today. You can see it in the gold price. And we also have a debt crisis coming out of the crisis back in 2008, 2009, when we put in interest rates that are extremely low. The result was an explosion of debt. Not to bore you with numbers, especially after a long day, but global debt today is now over $300 trillion US. 3 times the size of the global economy. So Uzbekistan has been wise. Your debt ratio to government GDP is one of the lowest in the world, 35%, much better than my country, which is over 120%, and much better than Japan, which is 254%, amazingly. So with interest rates moving up, countries all around the world are going to be facing a very real challenge. So in terms of one of the reasons that we have a crisis today is that the leaders of the world have not dealt with inflation. They've not dealt with things like the immigration crisis in some of the countries around the world. They've been a failure of leadership. And so that's why we have turbulent politics. And that's why, too, we have a situation, for example, on renewables, which is solar panels and wind farms. The problem is not that they are in and of themselves a problem. They're not. They have their place. But we should recognize by now that wind and solar are going to be additional sources of energy. They're not going to replace fossil fuels. They'll be an additional source. And the reason is that the world's appetite for energy is only going to go up. As countries like yours develop, the need for automobiles is going to go up. Most of those will be gasoline fueled, and so we're going to need more energy there. And then, too, you have AI. You have not only artificial intelligence, but also the whole high-tech area needs more energy. For example, the cloud today The cloud today absorbs twice as much electricity and energy as the entire nation of Japan. And it's just going to grow in the future. So in terms of looking out ahead, the energy needs are going to be voluminous, and unfortunately, countries, including my own, Germany, Britain, and others, have spent literally trillions of dollars pursuing renewables in the wrong way. Since 2000, the world has spent $7 trillion on renewables to replace oil and gas, but the amount of energy in the world that still depends on fossil fuels in that period of time for $7 trillion has only gone from 86% to 82%. Huge waste of money. Germany's energy costs, for example, are 2 to 3 times the electricity costs as in the United States. So in terms of the mistakes, this is why we have a lot of the politics we're having in the world today. The leaders delivered the wrong policies. So in terms of, let's look at the problems, one of course is inflation. One of the things that our central bankers overlook is that there are 2 kinds of inflation: monetary inflation and non-monetary inflation, 2 different sources of price rises. Non-monetary inflation comes from interruptions disrupting production. It could be weather disasters, natural disasters like floods or earthquakes will send up prices because production is disrupted. Could be from a war, as we're seeing with the war with Ukraine. Could come from the lockdowns, as we had during the pandemic, which raised prices. And so, and also regulations and taxes can raise prices. Those kinds of price increases that come from natural disasters, lockdowns, or raising taxes, raising regulations, those are something that central banks can't control. If you have a blockage at a port, raising interest rates or lowering interest rates is going to do nothing to alleviate that problem. However, this gets us to monetary inflation. Monetary inflation, the traditional kind, is simply reducing the value of a currency, usually by creating too much of it. And too often, monetary inflation and non-monetary inflation get confused together. And sometimes you can have both simultaneously. We had both simultaneously during the COVID lockdowns, the pandemic, and we're having a little bit of it today. So in terms of curing rising prices, they get confused, and we see it, and this is important, our central bank, the Federal Reserve in the United States, most important central bank in the world, headed by a man named Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell the other day made remarks about saying that tariffs might cause future inflation in the United States, and therefore the Federal Reserve might not lower interest rates. Well, in terms of tariffs, the Federal Reserve can do nothing about tariffs. So he should not allow that kind of price increases to have the Federal Reserve keep interest rates artificially high. So it's true, tariffs are taxes, they will raise prices, but the Federal Reserve is powerless to affect that, or should be. And we've seen in terms of supply chains, that's something tariffs are going to upset. Supply chains are very difficult to put back together when they're interrupted, as we saw from the pandemic. So what the Federal Reserve should focus on, what the Federal Reserve and other central banks should focus on, is stable currencies. One of the big flaws of central banks today is the belief that prosperity causes inflation. That when people do well, they say that'll send up prices and therefore the economy must be suppressed. It sounds very strange. It's called the Phillips curve, named after an economist decades ago who said if you want low unemployment, you have to have more inflation. If you want less inflation, you have to have more unemployment. Experience shows that that is nonsense. But even though experience shows it's nonsense, it is motivating our central bank today. It is absolutely false. Advanced countries still believe it, and it's a profound error. What they don't grasp is that money measures value. The way a scale measures weight, A clock measures time and a ruler measures length. Now imagine for a moment a central bank like the Federal Reserve was in charge of the Time Bureau, and they decided to float the clock. So you have 60 minutes an hour one day, 30 minutes the next, 45 minutes the day after. You can see life would be very confusing. What you want in the marketplace are stable measures of value, stable measures of things. So in terms of the floating clock, imagine baking bread. Let's say you have a recipe that says you should bake it for 20 minutes. Now you have to, if you had a floating clock, you'd have to determine are those nominal minutes or inflation adjusted minutes. You can tell it would be a very confusing world. So today, currencies are losing value. You can see it in the rise in the price of gold. The best barometer for future inflation is gold. It is for a variety of reasons. It keeps its intrinsic value better than anything on the earth, and has done so for 4,000 years. When you see a change in the price of gold, it's not so much the value of gold that's changing, it is the value of the currency that is changing. So when you see in the US, in the last 2 years, gold has gone from $1,800 to now about $3,300, which means we're going to have some real inflation in the future. It's not that the value of gold has gone up, but the value of the dollar is seen as going down. Very subtle, but very important. Gold is stable, currencies float up and down, but that sometimes is not recognized. So most countries, currencies are weakening. And so we must have so in terms of a future gold standard, it won't be like the classical one of the 1800s. What it'll be is they'll have a range. For the US, it might be a range of, say, $3,200 to $3,300. Keep it within that range. If it goes above $3,300, you reduce the money supply. If it goes below $3,200, you increase the money supply, but you keep it within that narrow range. Get back stability. So in terms of the future inflation, we're going to have future inflation, one from tariffs, but also from the weakening of currencies around the world. This won't last forever, obviously, but you should be prepared short term for these unnecessary storms. Now, this brings us to tariffs and the possibility of a global trade war. The thing to keep in mind is, and some leaders overlook it, and that is tariff is another word for tax. A sales tax, a value-added tax, an excise tax, whatever name you want to give to it, it is a tax on products that are imported. So if not negotiated down, all the tariff increases that the United States has put in place are going to mean a global trade war. That means a global turn down in economic activity. I've mentioned the flaw of central banks. Prosperity causes inflation, but another one that is motivating our central bank and therefore has global repercussions is the belief that trade deficits and surpluses are very important. Now, what I'm about to say, a lot of economists will disagree with, but in and of themselves, trade deficits and trade surpluses, those numbers tell you nothing about the health of an economy. Nothing. They ignore capital flows. They ignore other things that affect companies having transactions with each other across the border. To put trade deficits and surplus in perspective, my country, the United States, had trade deficits for example, most of the 1800s. As we went from a small agricultural nation to the mightiest industrial nation in the world, we always had trade deficits. So a trade deficit is not the equivalent of a company losing money. It's really an accounting artifact. It ignores flows of capital flowing into the country. We have great flows of capital in the 1800s. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, by contrast, when our economy and the global economy was shrinking, the U.S. had 25% unemployment. During the Great Depression, we had trade surpluses. which in the circumstances meant nothing. In the 1980s and 1990s, when the U.S. economy was booming, we had increasing trade deficits. In the late 1990s, we had budget surpluses. Didn't last long before we had budget surpluses, but at the same time we had trade deficit. Now this is something the current government in the U.S. does not seem to understand. That trade surpluses or deficits do not reflect the health of the economy. It depends on the circumstances. So in terms of looking at the tariffs today, we have the situation in the U.S. where they've put on a 10% tariff on everybody, including you. They also put on tariffs, shows how they did not do their homework. They put on tariffs on a set of islands off of Australia called the Heard and McDonald Islands. They now have a 10% tariff. But what they overlooked as, there are no people on those islands, only penguins. So how they're going to collect tariffs from penguins has not yet been decided. But it shows how the homework was not done. So in terms of also, when they put on what they call reciprocal tariffs, some like China's to pick a number with China, it changes each day, 145, 245%. But on other countries, it's 36%, other countries, 49%. Those numbers were derived using trade deficits, but leaving out services. Now, I hate to keep boring you with numbers, but the day is almost over. But the U.S. has a $1.2 trillion overall trade deficit, but it has a $300 billion service surplus. We export services like entertainment, banking services, and the like. They ignored that. These trade numbers also ignored the fact that the U.S. exports a lot of stock. A lot of people like to buy U.S. equities. They also like to buy our bonds. I don't know whether they like it, but they do it. Yet that's not counted in the trade numbers. The 1930s saw trade wars, and we saw where that led to the Second World War. We must avoid that today. I'm hoping that this 90-day pause that was announced a week ago or so, that during that time there will be some agreements on trade and we avoid a global trade war, as I actually think we will. So the thing to remember is after 1945, after World War II, the whole trend of the world was to reduce trade blockages, trade barriers, reduce tariffs, reduce non-tariff barriers. And the result was the global economy boomed, including after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. Many countries of the former Soviet Union, are an example of it, are now growing today. Trade, you don't grow without trade. And so you look at the global economy, in the last 50 years, the global economy has increased sixfold. Incomes have grown fourfold around the world. Some countries more than ever, but overall the world has prospered as never before, and trade grew even faster than GDP did. Trade is essential. Now trade, and one of the facilitators of trade this doesn't sound like high technology. One of the boosters of trade, of course, was the invention of the container, what they call the box. It was invented by a trucker back in the 1960s. Took several years before people began to adapt it around the world. But with the invention of the box, trade costs, shipping costs for most commodities fell by 95%. Why? Because before the box, it took back-breaking labor to load those freighters and unload them. You had a lot of pilferage, a lot of stealing, a lot of breakage. So between 1985 and 2005, global trade quadrupled with the box. And thanks to the box, you could get global supply chains that made possible things like your handheld. You could not have had these handhelds, the Apples and the others, if it had not been for the box and the supply chains they made possible. So trade patterns will be changing in the years ahead. But the key thing is, I think what we're going through now, even though it's going to be disruptive, will be actually an aberration. And I think you're going to, once again, when this aberration gets over, you'll see, once again, a move to reducing trade barriers rather than increasing them. Now you say, well, when will the United States change policy? We have elections every 2 years for Congress. And if the economy is not doing well, a lot of those Congress people will lose their jobs. They don't want to lose their jobs, which means they will change policy. So the elections will be a good check on that. So the bottom line is, the negotiations are already underway, and there are reports that President Trump has already talked with President Xi of China. They've not acknowledged it, but it looks like those conversations have just begun, which is a good thing in resolving this crisis. All this underscores, then, is what does make possible economic growth. Economic growth means more products and services, higher wages, a better standard of living. So how do you reduce poverty? You do it through economic freedom, which you've begun to do in this country and must continue to do. And I will say this, I'm taking a plane tonight so I can say it and not worry, and that is, less government control means more prosperity. Okay, no police are around. So the formula is very simple. Low tax rates, which you already have. Stable money, which we will get with a gold standard, and less regulation. I'd like to share with you some examples of states around the world, countries around the world that are achieving great success, and you'll be already beginning to join their ranks. One, of course, has been Hong Kong, especially before the handover in the late 1990s. After World War II, Hong Kong was a very poor area, had no prosperity at all. But they put in policies, low tax rate, low level of government spending, fewer regulations, free trade, no barriers, no tariffs, and a sound currency. In the early 1980s, Hong Kong fixed its currency to the US dollar. So that's not in Beijing's hands, it's in the Federal Reserve's hands. But the thing is, Hong Kong went from a very poor area, a few $100s of per capita income after World War II, to one of the richest areas in the world today. Another example would be Singapore, also a very poor area, but after the 1960s, with those low tax rates they have there, under 20%, less regulation, sound currency, Singapore has boomed. Give you the example of South Korea. In the early 1960s, South Korea was one of the 3 or 4 poorest nations in the world. In 1962, the per capita income was $106 US, 106. Today, thanks to the reforms South Korea put in, it's gone from $106 to $36,000 per capita. Extraordinary growth coming with economic freedom. Another example, closer to home, of course, is Vietnam. In 1992, Vietnam was the poorest country in the world, poorer than all the African countries, poorer than the country of Haiti, which is the poorest area in my part of the world. But they made reforms, allowing private property, starting small businesses. They even have seminars today teaching people why being rich is good. And so even though they're nominally communist, they praise people getting ahead. They praise entrepreneurs. So in the early 1990s, per capita income was $230. Today it's over $4,000 and rising. And so in turn, you take Poland and Europe, very poor there, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s, they made reforms. In 1992, their per capita GDP was $4,000. Today, it's almost $18,000. So great growth comes with economic freedom. and all share, each one of those examples share the basic principles: more economic freedom rather than government control. Let me just close this out with giving you two examples of countries that went in the opposite direction. The most famous one is Argentina. 110 years ago, Argentina was one of the most richest countries in the world. It had per capita income the same as the United States. But then they went for more government control, rampant inflation. Except for the 1990s, Argentina had double-digit or triple-digit or quadruple-digit inflation every single year. So they went from the top 10 to ranking about 70 or 80 today, and we're going downhill. As you know, they elected a new president a year and a half ago, Javier Milei, who has made radical changes. One change that he still has to make is that since the peso, nobody in Argentina likes the peso, he promised to replace it with the dollar. Ecuador has already done that. El Salvador has done that, just threw their currency out, put in the dollar because they didn't trust their governments. He promised to do that in Argentina, and we hope that he will finally do that promise, because nobody uses the peso for transactions if they can avoid it in Argentina. They use dollars because they trust the dollar, they don't trust the peso. But another example of like Argentina of going from rich to poor is Venezuela. In the 1970s, it was one of the top 20 countries in the world. Today, it is now one of the poorest countries, as 1/4 of the population has already fled because of socialism. In the case of Uzbekistan, your country, you've been making steady growth over the years, and hopefully you'll continue the transition to a market economy and become a even greater success story in the future. Your taxes, I like the fact you have a flat tax, 12%. Your corporate tax of 15%, half of that for IT, is good. You have your payroll taxes could be cut a little bit, but not bad by global standards. Your VAT, not bad. Government spending as a percent of GDP can come down a little bit, but your government debt, as I mentioned earlier, is actually quite good compared to the rest of the world. And you're also, and I'm glad our country's cooperating, you've begun the accession process to become part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. I'm delighted to see that we're in the process of making some agreements with your country, particularly in the area of rare minerals, exploration and training, innovative technologies. You're doing special economic zones, you should do that. And so in terms of exports, everyone thinks of cotton, but you're way beyond cotton. But one of the exports, as I mentioned, that is going to hold you in good stead is gold, because we will be going back to a gold standard because of events. And even though gold standard is always downgraded among experts, the fact of the matter is central banks have been buying gold as never before. So if gold is no good, why are central banks buying it? So the gold standard is coming. Now this gets to something very important, and that is the need for a stable currency. You should consider putting in something called a currency board, which simply means you take what they call an anchor currency or strong currency, like the dollar or the euro, and just fix it to that currency, and every bit of your currency would be tied to the dollar or the euro, or maybe the two of them. Each currency unit will be tied to the dollar or the euro. Countries have done it very successfully. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, experienced hyperinflation. And then they put in currency boards, variations of them, tied their currency then to the Deutschmark. When the Deutschmark became the euro, they made that switch. Another example is Bulgaria, which had terrible inflation in the late 1990s. They went to a currency board, tying first to the Deutschmark and then the euro, and within months, the inflation ended. So I'd recommend you consider something like the currency board, so people don't have to worry about what governments in the future might do to the value of your currency. So in terms of that's critical. You should continue privatizations. You've made some progress there, but much more could be done. Poland did massive amounts of privatization right through 2015, and even developed a financial market in Warsaw. So continue to do that, trusting entrepreneurs, not the government. And you should reduce subsidies. I can say this because it's easy to say it rather than have to do it, but subsidies to state-owned enterprises, which now constitute about 40–45% of the economy, should be reduced as well. There should be labor reforms and improvement registration processes. That is, make it very easy to set up a legal business. A good example is New Zealand. In New Zealand, you can start a legal business with a few keystrokes on a computer, no lengthy licensing procedures, no having to put down a lot of capital and delays. You can do it within a matter of a few hours or a few days. Make it easy to set up legal businesses, have a sound currency, and the informal economy will start to disappear, which is still a major factor in this country and in other countries. When you have a system that makes it easy to do business, open environment, the informal economies tend to shrink. So, in terms of the future, Uzbekistan has a very, very promising future, but don't stop now. In terms of economic freedom, it's like riding a bicycle. You have to keep moving. You don't want to fall over. Now, this then gets to investment areas to look to in the future. One area, and you're an example of it, is the huge possibilities of health care. There are going to be two revolutions in health care. One is the delivery of health care, and the other is great breakthroughs against various diseases and illnesses. The United States, there's a revolution beginning in health care. In most countries, you have a government dominating health care. In Britain, for example, it's the whole system. In other countries, you have a few private sectors, but it's still government dominated. The U.S. has what you might call a hybrid system. We have heavy government involvement, but we also have a lot of privately owned hospitals and clinics and the like. But the opportunity is coming because what is happening is we have something called health savings accounts, which began 20 years ago, but what it is employers or the government can put money, or you can put money in a health savings account, which means you control the money. In Singapore, for example, they have a tax there, but the money doesn't go to the government for health. It goes into your own account, like a bank account. And so if you go to Singapore, you'll see at certain times of the year advertisements of insurance companies advertising for your business, hospitals advertising for your business. And as a result, Singapore, which has physicians trained in great schools all around the world, they are what they call board certified. Their outcomes are among the best in the world. The cost of healthcare in Singapore is 25–30% of the costs in healthcare in the United States and elsewhere when you put in real costs. They do it because the patient is in charge with the money, not government bureaucracies. So in the future, as you develop your healthcare system, you're developing healthcare physicians now, healthcare other aides and nurses and the like. That is something to consider in the future. So in terms of looking at the future, another area is in terms of and by the way, in Singapore, they have total universal coverage. If for whatever reason you can't have the equivalent of their health savings accounts, the government will step in. But that's only about 2 or 3% of the population. The rest, the patient is in charge. So I think what you're going to see is going to gain traction in the U.S. This will revolutionize the delivery of health care around the world, turning health care from a drain on budgets to a growth industry. Just as you see in every other market, where consumers, in this case patients, are in charge, where customers are in charge, guess what happens? You get productivity, you get inventions, you get what they call the learning curve, constantly improving things. So in Uzbekistan, we're doing some work with the Cleveland Clinic. You should continue to do that. and with other institutions like the Mayo Clinic, one of the things you should consider is becoming what other countries have done, and that is engage in what is called medical tourism. That is, you have specialized facilities here where people around the world come and they get good treatment, affordable treatment, and they feel they get better treatment at these medical facilities than they do at home. For example, for cosmetic surgery, none of you need it, but some people do. For cosmetic surgery, you have Thailand, Brazil, South Korea are experts in those areas. For dental work, sophisticated dental work, who would have thought that Mexico, Hungary, and Costa Rica are known as places to go? For fertility, Spain, India, Czech Republic. For orthopedic work, Malaysia, Germany, some parts of the United Arab Emirates. So in terms of medical tourism, you should become a center where you have specialized facilities. Make it possible. Have incentives there to do it. Other countries do well with it. You can too. You're already starting to develop the infrastructure, the expertise infrastructure to do it. In terms of the breakthroughs coming in healthcare, you see it in vaccines coming for cancer, and you see it too coming in the next few years. As you know, for heart, lung, liver, kidney, if those go wrong with you, you have to hope you can find somebody who can be a donor for a kidney, or some patient who dies can give your heart replacement. Very, very dicey system. But the research is being done where we'll be able to replace things like hearts, lungs, liver, kidneys, like we do a tire of an automobile. Research is being done, and that'll come to pass, and people will wonder, what was the big deal about changing a heart? It's amazing. Now, I mentioned in terms of the frontier, I mentioned artificial intelligence, which you should look to apply even more to agriculture, which is one of your strengths. But there's a material called graphene, and its impact in a number of areas is going to be profound. In essence, graphene is one atom thick sheet of graphite, one atom thick, so you can't see it until you put a lot of them together. But it has astounding properties. Graphene has 200 times the strength, 200 times the strength of steel, 1,000 times the conductivity of copper. Imagine what that's going to do to electronics, improving the delivery of electricity 1,000-fold. The two physics people who pioneered this in England in the early 2000s, they won the Nobel Prize in 2010. Fantastic potential, but the thing that has held it back so far is cost. Initially, it has been very expensive to make this material. And as with anything, unless you get costs down, it's not going to be finding widespread use. But that is now beginning to happen, and you should be looking at the progress of graphene. A number of companies are involved in it because that is going to be the future in everything from healthcare, infrastructure, making cement durability instead of having to change it or cure it in a few years. Cement can last forever. And so in terms of the future, in terms of manufacturing, that is an extraordinary thing. Graphene. Keep an eye on that. So in terms of the economic revolution, I mentioned that the gold standard is coming. Also, too, in terms of healthcare, a revolution is coming. And in terms of the new gold standard, it won't be the classical one. It'll be more like, as I said, governments keeping it in a certain range. And then another thing, for those of you who are interested in economics, there's another revolution coming. Gold standard has been around, so that's a restoration of a good system when done right, is something called time pricing. Right now, when we think of prices, we think of it in terms of a currency. A certain product or service costs so much in the marketplace. But now in terms of measuring an economy, in terms of measuring well-being, in terms of measuring wealth, there's a revolution called time pricing. instead of money prices, which are fraught with problems of adjusting for inflation. What measure do you use for inflation? But the time pricing means how much time does it take to make a certain product or consume a certain product. Not money, but time. For example, years ago in India, it took a typical Indian 7 hours of work to be able to buy enough rice to live that day. 7 hours. Today, it is less than 1 hour. Time pricing. So you don't have to look at rupees or anything else. How long do you have to work to earn enough to get a certain product? And as a result, we've seen in recent years, last 30, 40 years, even though we have a lot of problems in the world, it turns out when you look at time pricing, both in the amount of time it takes to work to get more goods and services, but the amount of goods and services has increased as well. So in terms of looking at the future, we're going to get much more accurate measurements of how we're doing, how many hours it takes to do things. We're going to have a stable currency with a gold standard, and hopefully in the near future we'll make the word tariff something that people don't know what it is. It's a tax, and the way to prosperity is the fewer taxes, the better. So expect short-term turbulence, short-term problems, but in terms of looking at the total future, the entrepreneur is going to come into his or her own as never before, and you're going to be living in an extraordinary time. And one thing for entrepreneurs, and I think you had a speaker last December who emphasized this, is always keep track of cash flow. Cash flow. It does in entrepreneurs more than anything else. They miscalculate what it takes to keep their business going and growing. So just bed that in your mind. And finally, just remember that when you leave here, your education is just beginning. You don't come out fully formed. I'll just give you one example in closing. Famous Steve Jobs, of course, Apple. We did with Steve Wozniak years ago. Steve Jobs, if you took away his name and gave his personality characteristics to somebody hiring somebody, they would throw his name in the waste paper basket. He was argumentative. He put down people. He stole ideas. Terrible to work with. And that's why he was fired in the mid-1980s from the company he co-founded. Imagine starting a company and getting fired by your own company. But he learned in the years ahead how to become an effective leader, how to put together creative teams, how to motivate people. It wasn't natural for him, he learned it. And you're going to find too as you go through life, you're going to learn things from experience and also from the desire to get ahead. And so he turned from one of the worst corporate leaders you could have into one of the greatest ever. So don't despair if you stumble now or sometimes in the future. Just remember Jobs, get up, get on with it, and you too can achieve ultimate success. Thank you very much.